Okay, Elmer, go ahead.
When I was 18 years old, Pearl Harbor had just occurred, and I saw a write-up in the newspaper that the University of Chicago was going to have a class in military cadets to teach meteorology for weather officers. So I lived about 2 miles from University of Chicago, so I went over and applied. So in effect, I was trying to enlist, but my draft notice came first. And then about 2 weeks into basic training, they pulled me out of basic training, and I was in a plane and went to Haverford, Pennsylvania, and wound up at a Haverford College. This was a Quaker college, and just boys. And of course, the Quakers were non-combatants, and the school was deteriorating as far as membership. The boys either were gone to Canada or they were conscientious objectors, and the president thought he could bring this military Air Force training school in, and his board of directors said, "Oh my goodness, we can't have military on the Quaker campus." And his response was, "We're training scientists, not combatants." So we did not have a gun on the campus, but every 3 months we went down to Fort Dix and played soldier and spent time on the rifle range and learning to use gas masks and so forth.
That's a great place. We'll stop just right there so I can test the audio. Hello, this is Leonard Jackson for Witness to War. We are here today with Elmer Nelson. How are you, Elmer?
I'm just fine.
Please state your name and your branch of service, please.
Elmer Nelson, Nelson. I spent my wartime service in the Air Force, Army Air Force. They originally was the Army Air Corps, and then they became an Army Air Force.
Today is December 7th, 2013, and it's the 72nd anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Elmer, do you remember where you were when Pearl Harbor happened?
Yes, I do. I was 17 years old. I was in the backyard of my house in Chicago, and the lady next door came running out of her house screaming, "Pearl Harbor has been bombed." And I heard about that in that manner. And I was 17 and a half. 6 months later, I became 18 and had to register for the draft. In the meantime, then, while I was waiting to hear from the Army, I learned that the University of Chicago was going to have a meteorology training course for Air Force people. So I applied for that. I thought that's only 2 miles from home. That'd be great. But I didn't hear from them, and in December I got that's exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, I got my notice of draft. And in January I was inducted in service. So that came before I heard from the Air Force. They sent me to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri for basic training, and about 2 weeks into the basic training, they pulled me out, and I was on a train heading for Haverford, Pennsylvania for a meteorology training course. So that application caught up. Haverford, incidentally, was a Quaker college and did not allow military service. And the school was declining in members, in the students. They were all boys, and they were conscientious objectors, and the school could have been closed. So the president suggested that they bring the military on there. His board objected, and he said, "We can't have military on our campus." But he said, "Well, this won't be, we aren't training combatants, we're training scientists." And that enabled them to bring the Air Force on. Most of the teachers were professors from Haverford. So we had top-line teachers teaching math, physics, chemistry, history, in a whole array of subjects. They determined after a little while that they had more people training for that than they needed, and I wound up going to a weather observer school down in Chanute Field. That's in Rantoul, Illinois, central part of Illinois. From there,
So you've just finished training school, and they send you to Illinois. And what did they send you there to do?
that was the weather observer school. It was a specialist, and that was about, I think 2 or 3 months. And then I was sent to Morrisfield in Charlotte, North Carolina, to work in the weather station. This was a field where they trained A-20 pilots and crew on their last stop before they went into war service. They trained A-20s. It's a 2-engine bomber, and we provided weather for these guys. From there, I went to 2 or 3 other smaller air bases in North Carolina, and I was getting bored with North Carolina and asked if I could get foreign service. They asked if I would be willing to go to the Arctic, and I said, yeah, give me a try. And I was shipped up to Baffin Island. There was a main base up there where they had an emergency airfield. This was called Frobisher Bay, and we got up there and learned about our Arctic training. They supported 3 outposts, Lake Harbor, River Clyde, and Padloodaping Islands. I was assigned to Lake Harbor, and 5 guys, 2 radio men, 2 radio mechanic, and 2 weathermen went to this outpost. So my story will be primarily to tell about how we could live in a very primitive society. Our purpose was to provide weather information for planes that were just flying from Newfoundland to Iceland to Scotland for combat in Europe. And
Is that the main mode of transportation that these planes had to take to get from the United States to Europe through Newfoundland and then Scotland?
It was the way they had to transport these fighter planes from U.S. to Europe for combat. And at that time, you remember now, this was 70 years ago. These were brand new planes. Rosie the Riveter put them together, and our industry did a miracle of a job to produce all of them. But they didn't have the quality. They didn't have the flight capacity. They needed more information. And then we provided upper air wind speed and direction. In addition to providing information for the planes flying over, this was a source region for weather that moved across the North Atlantic and gave them about a 3-day lead time for bombing conditions over the continent. Baffin Island was just west of Greenland, and these little weather stations were not permanent bases at all. When I was assigned then to Lake Harbor, they have about 90 days of open water, so we had to go in by ship. And to get on the ship, they put us on a big freighter that was in Frobisher Bay. We went out into the Arctic Ocean, met a Coast Guard icebreaker, and we transferred from that big freighter by rope ladder down to this icebreaker. I've never been so scared in my life as to be on a rope ladder in the middle of the ocean, and the boats are floating apart, and I wondered if I'd ever live through that, but I'm still scary about that.
Could you explain one more time what the rope ladder was taking you to, and what was the purpose of needing to take that ladder?
Because the freighter was so much higher than than the icebreaker. It was a smaller boat, much smaller boat.
So once you got off the boat, you had to climb up to get there.
No, we had to climb down.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And then on the deck of this icebreaker were the year's supplies that we would need at this station. Coal for heating our buildings, our year's supply of food, and any equipment, anything we would need. And they had 2 diesel generators and a couple signal corps guys on there because they were going to replace the generators we had to produce the electricity that we needed to light our buildings and give us power for our radio transmission. When we got on this ship, I found out that I was right when I was wrong when I wanted to be in the Navy because I was seasick in about 30 minutes. But I got over that. When we came to the mouth of Lake Harbor, there were no navigational aids, so the ship had to stop, and we waited for an Eskimo to come out in a kayak and climb up on the deck of the Coast Guard ship and motion to the commander, go a little to the right and to the left. And I'm sure he didn't speak the language, so he would use sign language to bring the ship in. An icebreaker, at that time, they had a big, very heavy front end with concrete and heavy steel so they could break ice and free any boats that had got tangled up there. When we came to Lake Harbor, there were no docks, loading docks. So all of our year's supplies had to be lowered onto small boats, come up to the shore, and then any Eskimos and Air Force guys and ship's crew, we had to unload them, little boats, and carry everything up a rocky hill. The diesel generators were very heavy, so I have a picture here of probably 24 people pulling a dog sled up the hill with that heavy generator. We had 3 buildings up there, one for our supplies, one for our weather station and radio and kitchen, and the other was where we lived. We separated the buildings so that in case of a fire or a snow slide or something of that sort, we wouldn't be wiped out. We divided our supplies amongst the 3 buildings. And you realize we heated those buildings with coal, and we had to haul those coal sacks up. What did you do for water? Well, for about 3 months, we got water from a little freshwater lake nearby, just in a pipe, no filtration, nothing, just water came down. And then when the water on that lake started to freeze, about the 1st of October, we went up and spent a week just cutting blocks of ice with saws and axes and stacked it like firewood. And once a week, then we would go up and haul the ice down. Otherwise, the ice would be 6 feet deep, and you would never be able to get water. So as a consequence, we went a year without a shower. Just this water was just for our drinking and to try to and cooking. What did we do? Every 3 hours, we had to send information out by radio, and we read all of the instruments for the day, for the station and temperature, weather, type of clouds and things like that, and then we put these weather things into a defined report and into a coding machine, and the coding machine converted our weather information into 5-digit numerics that we had to transmit by Morse code. And we transmitted them down to Goose Bay, Labrador, and Goose Bay then would provide the information for the flights going across. But we couldn't do that in plain English, because then the enemy, the Germans, could have listened to our weather. So it was a coded machine. Then a big major thing, twice a day, noon and midnight, we had to send up a balloon filled with hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is very flammable, and we had a separate little building off to the side where we had to generate our own hydrogen. We had, and that building had two steel drums or steel cylinders. One of them we dumped iron filings, caustic soda, and hot water, sealed it, and the chemical reaction would release hydrogen that we tapped into a different cylinder that we would use to fill the balloons. Now, we had to bring all of that stuff with us when we came up there. And about once a week we had to generate the hydrogen again. This balloon would be so big, it would be probably 6 feet in diameter. And we would fill it when the balloon would just float in the room, then we knew we had the right amount. And when you stop and realize we were so far north that we had got down to the point where we had 23 hours of darkness, we attached a little lantern, a little flashlight to the balloon. And we released that, and one guy went up on the roof of a building to a little stand, and using a machine called a theodolite. It's like a telescope, but it had once every minute it would beep, and the guy on the roof would have to read the horizontal and vertical numbers on there, and the guy in the building would then plot those numbers on a big plotting board and then measure them, and he could tell then the height of the balloon, and they got ideas on the speed and the direction of the upper air, and that became very, very important to the flyers. So we had to do that twice every day, and at times you'd run into clouds. Other times the balloon would explode. Other times you'd just lose it. But that was a major function, and there was up there no supply department to order new hydrogen. When we needed hydrogen, we had to make it ourselves. So everything we did, we had to do for ourselves. If something broke, we had to fix it. Our buildings were plywood. We cut blocks of snow with saws and piled them on the outside of our building for insulation from the wind, to keep us from freezing. Talk about freezing. We had an instrument called a thermograph that recorded the daily temperature, and the graph ran for a week. And we had one stretch for 3 weeks where the line was at -40 for 3 weeks. It didn't vary. We had one time it dipped it all the way to 69 below zero. So we had to learn to actually live in some very, very adverse conditions. I have a shoulder patch that supposed to denote the 23 hours of darkness, or 24 hours of darkness. And we didn't have Army uniforms up. All we had was Arctic issue, the big parkas, and in the winter, all of our shoes were made of felt for warmth. You had inner linings and then the felt. And then in the summer, the land would the snow would be gone, but it became a big marsh, and it never thawed more than about 6 inches. So we wore shoes that had, or boots that had rubber shoes. So we didn't have any need for army shoes. So when we had, actually, I'm jumping ahead for a minute, but when we were finally pulled out, we got to New York. We were still wearing our Arctic issue. We didn't even have a uniform, and they took we couldn't travel from there to a death separation center. I was discharged back in Fort Sheridan, Illinois, but they had to take those Arctic uniforms, and and then they put uniforms on us, and I'm sure some supply sergeant in New York took that Arctic issue home and had nice ski trips in Adirondacks or someplace up in New York.
I have a question about you're living in this weather center for a year, and you said it was
Correct.
6 guys total?
5.
5. How did you keep yourself sane?
Well, that was a struggle. It got to, it's ridiculous. It got to where it annoyed you the way somebody held a spoon. I wondered many times with the darkness and everything how I would adjust to normal society when we came home, but we somehow or other were busy enough. It was just hard work living, and we had the Eskimos around. That all of our food, of course, was dehydrated or canned. We had 3 kinds of meat: canned Spam, canned corned beef hash, and canned hot dogs. A great variety. And the Eskimos, though, would bring fish in called an Arctic char. It looked like salmon, but they said it was a trout. And I have some pictures where the Eskimos were able to put nets, looked like tennis nets, under the ice, and the fish would get caught in those, and they'd pull them in and bring the fish to us and trade with us. And they would trade. They knew we liked seal liver. That tasted just like beef liver to us. And seal was the most prominent wild animal up there. The Eskimos lived on them. In the summertime, the Eskimos kind of came together, and in this Lake Harbor area. Otherwise, in the winter, they followed the traps, following a white fox that migrated across the Arctic, chasing a lemming, and they would trap them and trade those skins then with Hudson Bay Company for their supplies. Now, what did we? Money meant nothing. We had no medium of exchange. So we would offer to trade food. We had plenty of this dehydrated stuff. We'd offer to trade them army sweatshirts and heavy underwear and stuff. The Eskimos didn't want that. They wanted cigarettes. And the government, at that time, it wasn't a sin to smoke. The government supplied enough cigarettes, we could have heated our buildings, and I think we only had one guy that smoked. So we would trade cigarettes. And I have a collection of ivory carvings that the Eskimos made from walrus tusk, and the Eskimos would bring those in. I don't know how they did it. It must have been very, very tedious work, because ivory is very difficult, and these are beautiful things, but they traded those for cigarettes. Now, when you see what they carved, walrus, seal, narwhal, polar bear, they only could carve what they knew. These people never saw a horse, they never saw a tree, they never saw an automobile. They lived in a very, very primitive society. And it was a deal where in the winter they literally lived in those igloos that you read about as a kid. I don't know what it's like now, 70 years later, and the changing weather conditions up there, but at that time they lived just like that. And in the summer then, when the snow was gone, they put up a tent, and then they put some of the grass that they dried and on top of the tent, and then another tent on top of that. So the grass was kind of an insulation for them, and they lived in these tents then down near the Hudson Bay Trading Company. So life up there, while we had to do our job for the Air Force, providing the weather and flying information, our biggest job was figuring out how to live. And what we did, we had one of the radio guys was a farm boy who had lived by himself, and he did our cooking. So, and for making one main meal a day, we didn't give him any of the midnight balloon runs. So we worked that out. What did we do for entertainment? We had a pool table and played with that. We had all kinds of records. The government sent all kinds, from opera to light jazz and every kind of music there was. And people that now, of course, are no longer even entertainers, but we had a lot of music and we had a lot of books to read, but we had to do everything by code. We didn't have any ability to send mail out. Our parents received a letter from the Air Force telling them that they would not be hearing from us regularly, but that because of our service, but the government was in constant contact with us, and knew that we were safe. And we were supposed to get mail every once a month, dropped by parachute, but in a year's time, we received mail 3 times. Part of that is our place was so, we had no navigational aids, and the hours of darkness made it very difficult to even find us. One time we heard a plane, but they couldn't see us because we were down in a little valley there. So getting mail 3 times in a year was kind of a, and then they dropped the parachutes, by mail, by air. We gave the parachutes to the Eskimos, and they could use the cloth to make clothes, and they were thrilled with that. So that was again a different kind of life. So meals got very, very boring with powdered milk. Oh, I hate just to think of it, because it just tasted terrible, and you had to drink that when it was pretty cold. And if we wanted bread, we made it. And so we'd work a couple days or probably a whole day just baking bread. And then we'd put the extra loaves out in our storeroom, and they would freeze. And then every day we'd go out and get another loaf of bread. The Eskimos would bring seal liver, as I said, and fish. Once in a while, we got a piece of caribou when they could actually have a steak. The Eskimos, they talk about them trading that stuff. Again, they wanted cigarettes. The Eskimos had an amazing code of ethics among themselves. If they had their names that they picked up primarily from the Anglican missionaries that came there, names like Thomasy and Davidie and things of that sort, and other names were named after some physical characteristic. I was called Uvika, which meant, in their terms, the young one, and kind of fun now. I'm the old one, but they named everybody. They would come in and want to know if they could sweep the floor or do anything for us, and then we'd trade cigarettes. We could hire them. Well, they would do anything they could that we wanted, but we didn't have to worry about them stealing anything. We had a stack of, if we'd empty a cardboard box and put it outside our door, they would come and ask if they could buy that. They wouldn't throw it away or steal it. And if one Eskimo was running a trap line and he found a trap with a fox in it, and he knew somehow they must have identified with names that this belonged to somebody else, he would take the fox out so that it wouldn't be eaten by some other animal and skin it and preserve the skin. He might not find the guy that owned that for 3 months, but he would still have that skin to give to the proper owner. They did not steal from each other. I don't know what they would have done had they found somebody that cheated on that. I don't know, life was pretty cheap. They might have killed them. I don't know what the thing was, but they had an extremely high code of ethics, self-preservation, I'm sure, but it was admirable and something that we could all learn from. And I guess that they did learn something from this Anglican missionary that was working up there. The Eskimos had contact with the Hudson Bay Company, and then the Royal Canadian Police and this Anglican missionary were the only white people they had ever seen other than us when we were up there. I don't know what else, let's see.
Dean, you mentioned that one of the guys with you in the weather station went a little stir crazy. What happened and how did you deal with it?
Well, when we started, they actually had assigned a cook to our weather radio combo. And after a while, he started displaying extreme temper tantrums. If he was cooking something and it didn't go right, he might throw it against the wall and just slam it out. And just exploded. And another night at supper time, one of the guys said something and he was ready to start fighting. And living in those conditions, you couldn't allow that. Well, he had been in the Army for a while, and the war had ended then. So he had enough points to get discharged, even though he was at a place that was difficult to get to. So we radioed this Frobisher Bay headquarters and tried to explain this. And again, you're doing that with Morse code, and explain that we felt he needed to be moved out, and we knew that he had enough points. So they sent a message and said, so-and-so has enough points to be discharged. Please hire a dog sled through the Hudson Bay Company and have him brought to back to Frobisher Bay. And we did that, and he thought that was quite an adventure, so he didn't resist that idea at all, and he traveled 100 miles by dog sled to this main base where they then could ship him home, and or if they had to treat him or not, I don't know. But again, we never heard anything from him. And again, I hate to cut somebody down, but again, this was very difficult living, and we couldn't live in fear in a situation like that. We had to be a team. We had to work together, and we tried to weigh that pretty seriously before we took any action.
Elmer, could you explain to us what years you were at the weather station?
Well, I was
and
in 1945 and then into 46.
So you were there when the war actually ended.
Yes.
Explain how you guys learned about that and what that was like.
We were up there. There had been 2 or 3 teams ahead of us. We were the final group. And that was in 1945, and the war ended, I don't remember exactly when, but we were there for about 3 or 4 months into 1946. My concern was, we're up here and we'll probably wind up in the Pacific. What a contrast, going to some tropical island from this. And then Mr. Truman dropped the bomb in Japan, and then we got word that they will be closing our base. So actually, we closed a little ahead of the summer open water. They flew a plane, a ski plane, a Grumman C-50, I think, but it was a small plane, and they could only take 2 of us out at a time. Now, what we had to do on this long inlet there where the boat had come in, we took coal sacks down and outlined a runway for that plane to land and pick us up. And when the plane landed, the skis created such friction on the ice that the plane froze to the ground. So when the next time when they had to take off the next day, they had to find every Eskimo in there and get behind the plane and push it to get it loose from this frozen being frozen to the water. So that was kind of a different twist too. And just the pilot, he was the only one, the pilot and then two passengers. So it was a small plane. And out on the street, I went to and stopped in a store, deli, and bought a quart of milk and sat on the street curb and drank a quart of milk because I hadn't had fresh milk for a year.
Now, there was a story about a doctor that you wanted to relay. What was that?
Yeah. Well, we didn't have any great medical needs, but, there's a potential. On that little ship that I was on, I had a large filling fall out, and I thought, oh, good night, I'm going to have trouble here. And that ship was too small to have a dentist, but the Navy corpsman on there just packed some kind of cement in that tooth, and I was in good shape until we came to Fort Sheridan to be discharged, and he drilled that out. But at one of the other bases on Baffin Island, a place called River Clyde, that was the farthest north of any of the bases. One guy got very, very ill, and we could hear them calling and transmitting, trying to convey to headquarters down in Goose Bay how sick this guy was. And they finally convinced them that they had to get help for this guy. He was so bad. And this was at a time of the year when the ice on the ocean was not heavy enough for a DC-3 to land on skis. They were far north, so they had to have a bigger plane than this thing that pulled us out of Lake Harbor. And there's about 6 weeks when you can't come in with a ship and you can't land on the ice, so you are totally isolated. So they flew a doctor up and dropped him by parachute at River Clyde. And he determined this boy had an appendicitis attack. And he actually performed an appendectomy, and his helpers were the radio men and weathermen up there with the whatever first aid supplies he brought with him. And then they had to wait a little while till they could ice get strong enough to pick him up and the boy that had been his surgery. And what they did, this doctor was out on skis and fell and broke his own leg, and the guys had to then bring him up to the base, and he had to tell them how to set his broken leg and splint it until he could be pulled out. Now that's the only physical problem in the group. Now we knew the fellows in all of these little bases because we had had our Arctic training together before they broke us into these. So it was just like a member of the family. And as far as we know, everything turned out okay, but that was kind of scary. And we leave our radios on just like a country party line, and we could hear people calling and talk about people calling. Things mentioned, the northern lights, aurora borealis, sometimes were so strong that they just would light up the sky, and they blocked out any of our radio signals in or out, and we might go a week and we couldn't contact anybody, and nobody could contact us because of the northern lights up there. Oh, I thought another.
He doesn't pick up everything you say to him, so you need to.
Go ahead and tell us about where you were worried about being discharged, Elmer.
Well, I've got two things. I'll tell you one other thing. The weather information that we had was not only being used, but had to be turned over to the Department of, I don't know what department in Washington, but they were keeping the scientific stuff. And we had to measure the water, the thickness of the ice on the bay. And we had a 40-foot tide up there, one of the highest, because again, the farther north you get, the higher the tide is. And once a week, we would measure the depth of the ice. Well, when it was a few inches and a couple feet, we could just chop a hole and put a stick down and measure. But when it got down to 5, 6 feet, we had no tools to drill. So we're soldiers, we had guns, we'd stand there and shoot and just pulverize it and then can scoop out. The Eskimos just about died because they saw us wasting all these bullets. They thought that was just terrible. But, well, we thought that's what soldiers do. They shoot bullets. So we shooting a hole in the ice to find out that the ice was 6 feet thick. Speaking of that, with the 40-foot tide, and you have this heavy base of ice, when the tide would go out, then that base would have to sink down to the water level. And for that whole harbor, when that ice started sinking, it was the awfulest, funniest, most memorable sound, just rumbled all the way out, I don't know how many miles. But that was kind of an amazing thing to when you realized what was happening. The thing I was thought about when we were up there and knew that we were due to be pulled out, thought kept going through my head. You know, what if the only guy that knows that we're still here got discharged and he's back in Louisville pumping gas at his station and wonders some morning, I wonder if anybody ever went up and got those guys. But they did. So.
And so now Elmer's talking about how different home life was from being in the Arctic weather station.
Well, from being up in the Arctic, we did not have a truck, we did not have a Jeep, and the only machinery we saw was our diesel generators for our electricity. And we got home, and they gave us our uniforms, put us on a train, and we headed for Fort Sheridan. Then I had to ride the train into Chicago and then go home. And I was literally afraid, and I physically, mentally afraid to cross the street. I'd want to have somebody hold on to me because of the activity of the trucks and cars and buses and so forth. It was just a frightening thing. And of course, it just shows the kind of mental adjustment that has to take place when you're living under those kinds of conditions.
These are some of the carvings that the Eskimos gave Elmer in the Arctic Weather Station. Go ahead and explain what that is.
Now, this is a polar bear, which they carved, and you can see the tiny little teeth and exquisite detail. These are better than anything I have seen in any museum, including the Chicago Museum of Natural History. These are very, very artistic, and they're made. The men did the main work, and then the women polish them and shine them up, and they sit for hours, and they work with files. And again, here's a walrus. Again, this is one of the things that they would see. Eskimos actually didn't eat walrus unless they were pretty hungry. They liked the walrus to get the food for feeding their dogs. So it must have been tough stuff. They would actually take the stomach out, and many times it would be full of shrimp that the Eskimos would actually eat. The kayak here, you can see here he has a harpoon. When they're hunting seals, they would throw the harpoon into the seal. The head of the harpoon was a metal thing, would come off, and it was attached to a lanyard which they would tie to a bladder, which was probably the stomach of a walrus or another. And that would float so that the seal wouldn't sink, and they could go after and hunt another seal. And then when they were through, they would collect these bladders and tow them in to find the seals that they had harpooned. Very, very crude, but very smart. Of course, they had to do that to live.
I was while you were doing that, I was focusing in, so we got lots of the good detail on those too. That's incredible. So they only carved these with actually ivory?
He can't hear you.
So this is when they carved it with other pieces of ivory?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they had files. That was the only instrument that I ever saw.
Laura, look at the
Look at the detail on the teeth.
Yeah. Here, you can hold it up to the camera.
Look at the teeth here.
I don't know if you're filming right.
No, I already got them on close to. Oh my god. Oh my god, how did they do that?
I don't know. We were.
Wow.
And we've had those for 70 years.
Hey, you know what? They feel sturdy too, like.
Oh, they're solid. Sure.
Now, actually, it would be against the law to bring this into the country now.
Now. Oh,
But
interesting.
when I had these up there, what I did, I took an old toolbox that we had up there and filled it with dry cereal, like oatmeal,
Yeah.
and dumped that in there, and then packed all this stuff, and I hung on to that until I got home.
Good.
Oh, I didn't let that out of my hands.
Good.
Oh yeah. Oh, these are so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing
Here, I
those.
can
with
bring
us.
them back to the table.
Yeah, bring those back. Let's go.
Feel how heavy it is. Huh?
Very heavy.
I like the polar bears.
Oh, yeah, the polar bears are great.
Oh my god, these are incredible.
This is amazing.
Narwhals.
Yeah.
I should have grabbed that one. I'm sure you had interesting stories about that.
Now, do you have a packet of that biographical stuff over there?
I do. I have my copy right here. Dean, can you help me get his microphone out right there?
Here are your glasses. Stay there just for a second, Dad. I'm going to unhook your microphone.
Is this everything you need?
Yeah, we're gonna get this. Let me make sure. Do we have the release form? Yep, got the release form. And then we're gonna keep
It
it right
takes a
back up.
couple minutes to pull
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
If the red light is on, is it still recording?